You are quiet. There we go. All right. I know your changes haven't been pushed yet, but that's all good. I shouldn't have any collisions with what I'm going to be doing here shortly. All right. So we have a live stream going on both Twitch and YouTube, and this is starting a video recording so that Derp can watch it later and maybe overload it, and you could, refer to it. But nevertheless, this is just going to go over a whole new kind of flow. Technically, Item has this already in the item slot map system, but it's a little convoluted in there. So we're going to go ahead and make a new one, and we're going to let's do expansion. You mentioned it, right? And what I did is I'm going to create a new folder called expansion. And folders in Go are packages, and packages are things that you can call. So we're going to go ahead and make a file in here called expansion.go. And you'll notice every file in Go has a package header term. And that basically defines what the package is referred to as. In this case, we're going to keep it synonymous with what the folder name and the file name is, which is expansion. So this package expansion is basically going to have some local variables, which is declared with var, that manage a function that's going to be exported. And we're going to be like expansion by ID, right? So you pass in an ID, and it's going to return a expansion. You know what? We're going to return a expansion name. So expansion name by ID, which is going to return a string and an error. Okay? I'm writing this on the fly, so if I'm a little inconsistent, it's because I'm literally writing this. So this function, you can actually define it. Expansion name by ID returns an expansion's name when provided an ID. One slight issue we're going to hit with this is that min expansion technically uses a value offset of 0 for classic, where I'm pretty sure the zone database uses 1 as, so they're offset by 1. They're inconsistent, but that's okay. We can hack that worst case. So we can see here inside of the zone database, as you know, there is an expansion field somewhere. In fact, let's go ahead and just write a query real quick. Select star from zone. Select, let's do short name expansion from zone. There you go. So here's all the different expansion IDs. And if we order that by the number, the lowest number on here is 1. And you'll notice these are all classic zones in EverQuest. So, okay. There's a couple ways you can do this. I'm going to actually write a caching mechanism as I put on the title of this. And what a caching is that the first query that happens, it will first try to access the data in some sort of source that's locally cached, like in memory. And if that data does not exist, it will query, grab the data, and then cache it afterwards, right? So then every follow-up call will be quicker. So to do that, we need a map. And the map will be an integer map to string for now. And this will be expansion names. And we can actually go ahead and say, make a map like this. And it's warning because it's unused because we just declared it. We're also going to write a block. This is something that happens in the future. They're called rewrite mutexes. This is so that we can handle, if multiple things try to access this at the same time, it can cause what's called a race condition, a collision. You know what I mean? Like if 20 people access the website and they all try to call this function, they could potentially try to access this data at the same time, and that causes race conditions. So mutex is one way that I personally like when you want granular control to kind of handle memory and make it so everyone has to wait in line and is sane. So I'll show how that's done here in just a second. I don't expect you to remember any of this. Worst case, you can copy paste, but I'm going to be talking as I write to kind of explain what I'm doing. So in order to get the ID from this expansion names list, we're going to want to do a read lock with an unlock with a defer. So what this means is we lock the memory, meaning, we check in and say, hey, we're going to do some reading of this thing. And the defer means is that when this function exits, unlock. So no matter how we exit, the code exiting will cause this check-in to unlock. That's super important. If you don't unlock, you can cause a lockup. Everything can potentially freeze because of this. So now that we have checked in, we can go expansion names and access by ID, right? And we can just say name is whatever the data is from here. Whenever you access maps, there's a Boolean that you can pass. And what this basically says is that kind of like the null check, right? If this Boolean says okay, then we know that we're good, and we can go ahead and just do this. Basically, if data is already in there, then the cache already has data and we're good. So at this point, we can return out, we have a success, we're done. But there is going to be another scenario, which is there is no data in there, right? This map has not been populated yet. So this is going to have to require another function. We're going to keep this in lowercase and call it, expansion name get, I guess. We don't really need the name get part. It's called expansion name. And we're going to just pass an ID. This is also going to have a string and an error return. And yeah, so what this is doing is the actual effort. So we can say, honestly, we could just, let's just expansion name ID, right? And then it's going to be name error. We're going to declare error up top. It just makes life a little easier. And then we can basically say, if error is nil, return with an error of expansion name and the failure. All right, that's just error handling. And we also have to empty the string return. Okay, so now we potentially are done with this, but we have to write now this function, which is called expansion name. And this expansion name query is going to be similar to all of our other queries, like this. And this is going to actually do the database query for this information. In our case, though, we don't actually use the database to get expansions. That's not stored in Heidi. So we're going to instead just create a map. There's a couple ways we could do a map. For the time being, just for simplicity's sakes, we're going to be like, if ID equals 1, return classic, right? That's the format of all this. But what we're going to actually do is I have this list in my wiki over here, right here. And we can do some string manipulation to basically say if this value, oops, get to the back there. If ID equals this, then return this. Oops. And then we can take out the zone and this, and we can also take that out. And now we can put the end semicolon, copy this, pop it in here. And oh yeah, this is always going to have to return a value. We don't need to worry about errors. Arguably, we should have error, though. So let's fix that, actually. Wait. Return nil on the ending of all these. Okay? Otherwise, if none of these find it, unknown expansion. So this is basically handling every single possible return type. And what will happen is this expansion by name will try to use this. And if we fail the expansion name, we're going to get that error. But otherwise, we can now put it in there. So we're going to go ahead and say moo runlock. We're going to do it early. We're going to lock it. And then we're going to defer a moo unlock. And we're going to say expansion names with the ID equals name. There. Well, what I'll do is for you is we'll just subtract 1 when we go to expand, to query this. And we'll just have this for now, have 0 as classic. I mean, we can go other way, but for now, let's just do that. So let's write some tests real quick. All right, so for our tests to work, we'll just copy this for inspiration. We don't actually need to do this anymore. In fact, I don't think we need any of this. So let's just do this. Package expansion func test expansion name by ID. Excuse me. And let's go ahead and say, and we're going to pass it like 0 real quick. And we're going to go name error is this. If error is nil, fatal it. Say this function failed with this error. All right. Otherwise, for now, we're going to just fail with whatever the expansion value is. Now, if we run this, fatal F is undefined. I didn't capitalize the T, or F. All right, so we got a stack trace. I'm pretty sure it's because runlock of unlocked rewrite mutex. Okay, so I have a collision with how I do this. It looks like it's about here. Oh, yeah, we want... Let's just do this. We're going to lock and unlock, not read lock, and then we don't have to do this crap, and that'll fix that issue. Ta-da! Expansion is classic. So it succeeded. So now we can go if name equals classic, or how about if name does not equal classic? And a handler for that, right? So if it's non-classic, it'll... Okay. And we can go ahead and run this twice. And I just want to see if it runs successfully twice. It does. And what for fun, we can write some like message real fast, just to be like, saved cache. That should only be called once, especially when we run it like this. So you see here, it says running saved cache, pass OK. So what that means is the cache was leveraged successfully, because you'll notice that the first time it calls, it'll try to get it from this listing. And if that listing fails, then it will populate it, right, by adding it from this list. Then it'll save it right here. And then the next call will be from memory, right? Because now this will be stored in memory with the new field inside there. So you only have to, store it in cache once. So there you go. So now we have a function called expansion name by ID. Do you have your code more or less ready?
Yes.
All right. Are you about to commit it? Go for it. I shouldn't conflict because, like I said, I only added expansion and there's no, obviously, impact to the original code for this. Cool. And while you did that, I'm going to go ahead and add it as a field in your NPC template. I'll show you how that's going to be done. I think it's that. We'll see here. Oh, min expansion's not in NPC types. Oh, that's right. It's in spawn data. Derp. So that won't work. All right. I'll pull yours here shortly and pretty much do the same work again. There it is. Now I have zone. I'll go ahead and discard my changes to NPC because it's not applicable. All right. So now that I have zone, I'm going to go ahead and add your code in, or my function into your code real fast, because why not? And you can see what I do. Okay, so we already have expansion, right? We're going to add a new field called expansion name. I'm not super intuitive with naming conventions. Keep it straightforward, why not? And similarly to how you have this being caressed during the rows next, we will have zone expansion name error equals expansion dot expansion by ID, and then we pass it your expansion field, subtract 1 from it. We'll handle the error that can potentially come from this, which is there. I passed the argument of whatever the expansion value is to. And now if we go to zone expansion and we go expansion, change this to expansion name and run the test. Expansion classic. Just like that. And we can go ahead and verify it with some other random one that's a high number, like, I don't know, how about Aviac, which is probably going to error actually because, oh wait, this needs to be a number, not a, this needs let's do apprentice, so 7. Yeah, see unknown expansion 98 because we didn't handle this, right? So what we do is we can do one of two things. I would say we'll say non-enabled, right? Not in game. It doesn't really matter. We can put whatever we want here, you know? But now, if we run that same test, expansion, not in game / disabled. But then if we go like Kazakh Thule, or how about chambers, so 98. Yep, expansion of war. So obviously I messed up my copy paste. Yeah. A few of these are messed up. I guess I could just fix it like this real quick. I always forget it. I think it's RAIN, right? Yeah. Ring of Scale, Burning Lands. Technically, there's also so it's TBL. Then you had Claws of Ishan, and then you had. Do you remember all of them? Claws of Ishan. There was one other. It's like Terror of Velius or something like that. Torment of Velius. And TOV was before Claws, so Claws and then Terror of Lucklin is 28. That's where I got terror from. You can tell I stopped playing, and you're probably the same, huh? Cool. So now we have all of these extra ones. That shouldn't hurt anything for, anything we're testing. Now we can hit run again. And yeah, this is working great now. And we have string names of zones. Arguably, we could also do this where, like, in the get, in parentheses, we can say, like, just so that the value is still exposed, but the name of the expansion is still listed. It's like here, Omens of War 9. All of that's pretty subjective and doesn't really matter at this point, but let's go to the website real quick and just verify that real fast. This control link doesn't work every time. Zone, there we go, classic 1. Now, when we leverage this later, like with min expansion, that value obviously won't have the offset, but that's as simple as this right here, right? If we bump it all, we take this out and we bump it on everything else. But I feel like min expansion is used more often than PEQ zone expansion. So that's why I'm going to keep it this way. And most of the time, classic will be 0. It's just an exception on zone only. So cool. Did that more or less make sense? Ultimately, and just to kind of recap this, we have expansion, right? Which is this function, expansion name by ID, which you pass an argument of ID and it returns the name, right? Or an error. And this, by default, will try to do what's called a cache, meaning this will be storing the results of previous queries. Otherwise, it'll run this function, and this function is placeholder for getting the query. And I say getting the query because later this format can be used for cross-database queries, right? So like if table A needs to query table B, instead of having to do a join, especially if table B is constantly referred to, we can cache it with a system like this. We're going to probably want to do the same thing with a zone cache at some point. So in fact, for fun, real fast, I mean, what are we at time-wise? 20 minutes? Let's see if I can do it real fast. We're going to do a, we have zone get. Let's just have zone. Okay. And we're going to take every reference of expansion, use sensitive replace, and change it to zone. And what we're going to do, instead of having this zone name by ID that you see here, what we're going to change this to is a query similar to this. Okay. And then what we're going to do is just select, let's do short name. In fact, we're going to call this zone short name by ID. And what this will do is select short name from zone where ID equals ID, and we do an instance query. We have to have C. We don't actually need this. We can just background it for now. We could do a timeout later. And then the args we have to pass as well. Honestly, for this, we could just do this. I'm just finding fields I'm messing up on, We don't need to do all this conversion. We can literally just set it to ID like that. Cool. And then we return with a failure that way. And this, we can go ahead. We need a zone struct. This struct will be a lot simpler because it's just one field, which is short name. Something like that. Then that maps zone. We don't need this crap. We don't need this crap. And with all of this done, arguably, we can just return break out of that and type in zone short name string. We do technically need the short name valid check. Something like this. If it's valid, just return zone short name string with nil. Otherwise, we don't need to do an else in this case. We can just return unknown. And then here, if this ever gets hit, we are going to return with a failure. Like that. Cool. And then what this does, why did this surrounding loop is unconditionally, it doesn't like that I'm handling this. Let's just do unknown zone as a fallback like this. I think that's okay. Okay. So now let's go write the test. Keeping up with me? And I think I called it zone short name, right? Yeah. So we just got to replace these. Okay, run the test. And we're getting an invalid nil pointer reference. Why? Zone is not liking, what? Is it args? Wait, why am I getting a nil pointer reference? It's requesting here, rows error, DB instance. DB has not been initialized. How do we handle that normally? DB usually needs a call like this. I think it's with my prep function. Yeah, see I have init echo. Arguably I could bring that, but I'm not. For this test, I'm just going to say there. We don't need a return. We just need a fail out. Zone name unknown zone 0. That's right, because there is no zone ID of 0. Let's try 1. We only need to do this test once. And it's going to error with expected classic got abyssal, because obviously that's what we want it to return, right? And just to double check that this actually works with what it's doing, a cache, we're going to write a print here and say, you know, getting the ID. So this query should only happen once, even though we're trying to run it twice, you know? Oh, we have to run it with this one, I guess. Getting ID 1. It's only happened once. That's perfect. It calls the cache the second time. So there you go. So now the reason I did this is there's going to be a lot of other endpoints that are going to need zone and some sort of data from it, right? To be human readable. And so this is just a way to cache all the zone names. We're actually going to rename this to short names, because as you know, there's long names and short names. There's no names in zone. And this could be renamed as well to zone short name. But there you go. Now we have, let's double check it runs. We added 2 caches. One cache for zone. We only have to query it once. We only do this query once. And then we have a cache that we can look up from then on that's getting locked and unlocked here. And the same thing with expansion. Now expansion has a lookup table cache as well. Cool. Yeah, and you can call this from anywhere as long as you know, like any package, like, oh, spell needs zone for some reason, right? You just go zone.zone short name by ID, and then you pass the argument just like it says. And you'll notice the comment I put is right here, even though it's horribly typed. And you know, as long as you pass an ID, it'll give you the short name or an error if there's a failure in the stack. You know what I mean? In fact, returns a zone's short name there. That's all we really need, right? There you go. And the reason I broke this into 2 different functions is then this function kind of encompasses however you get the data. And this will be boilerplate. You can just copy paste this pretty much for every call, you know, anytime we need a cache. So this will eliminate a lot of subqueries and like having to join tables and stuff, because, you know, what this data doesn't change or shouldn't change. In worst case, if we do have code, like if this ever does change, we could write a endpoint that basically lets you flush the cache. And what that'll do is, you know, we'd add functions like honestly, we wouldn't even have an error. And then we could just say, you know, lock, unlock, and in between that, say zone short names equals a new map. And that'll null it out. You see what I mean? That's how you can flush the cache. So then it will just refresh it as new data tries to request it later. I'm not even going to keep that in there, but that's how you would do that. But yeah, there you go. So we've added, let's look at what we committed. We added zone.go, which is the cache system. I didn't really call it cache because, you know, it's kind of a generic. We can start restructuring this later as it grows. Test name by ID, or yeah, test zone cache. Zone get now has expansion name, right? With the new function call here during the iteration of each row. Even though in get this only gets called once, it's still just a common pattern we can use. Getting the parameter field, I've changed it to 3, whatever, or 38. Here's the expansion name with the in parentheses the old expansion field number. And I added a new line to spell get. No, is it? Okay, well, let's take that out. That doesn't need to be committed, you know. Expansion caching with our baked list of expansions. And expansion test, which is currently just the endpoints for test. And then we're going to go added cache for zone and expansion. And this will be, if we go to GitHub,
you added a zone field to the MPC get as well, correct?
I did not. And the reason is that MPC doesn't have a one-to-one relationship with expansion. Like if you go to MPC types and look at its structure, there is no expansion fields in here. And that's because an MPC type, there is no reference to MPC to zone. It's like this. So there is a table that, you ready for some complexity? There is a table called spawn2, right? And in spawn2, you have spawn group IDs, right? So these have unique IDs for spawn2. They pivot to spawn group ID. They have zone short names, which by the way is a little ambiguous. They have versions, so like when there's different instances, that's common in like Eldon. The positioning of it, the heading, the respawn time, if it has a grid pathing, all this crap of data, or all this type of data, right? Enabled or not. So all of this in spawn2 ultimately gets into spawn group ID. So if we go to spawn group, you can see here, this is data, for example, of, you know, how fast it respawns. It has a despawn timer, things like that. And this is more of just like a data entry one. What you really care about is called spawn entry. And spawn entry then maps the MPC type ID to the spawn group. Okay? So your table query, I'm going to do it pseudo. I'm not going to do the whole thing, right? It's going to be like this. You know, select, let's say, zone short name, right? Comma, name, right? From, and then it's going to be like spawn2, right? And then you do what's called an inner join. And ultimately you have to join spawn2 with spawn entry with NPC types to ultimately get a layout that we can then display as, you know, this mob spawns here. Does that make sense? Yeah, it's a three-way pivot is what it's called. It's pivoting between different databases to get that data deduced, right? Because the zone is here, and the spawn group is then pivoted on that, and then spawn entry takes the spawn group and maps to NPC, and then we have to take the NPC types to get that NPC ID, right, and turn it into this, so that we have the data with the NPC as well, right? I guess arguably we could just do this. Integer spawn entry, and then you go on spawn entry dot spawn group ID equals spawn2 dot ID. No, spawn group ID. And where spawn entry NPC ID equals, let's go find an NPC real quick. How about, what's one that would definitely spawn? These are all like pets. Chances are a rabid wolf will spawn, right? So we want to do spawn entry NPC ID, spawn entry, I think zone ID. No, it's going to be in spawn group. Spawn2 zone. Let's see if that's enough. So this mob spawns in those hills